Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. T.I.M, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you. The grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. T.I.M, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with obituaries or sympathy cards. It doesn't arrive after a funeral, but it actually arrives after a verdict, after a policy change, and after another name becomes a hashtag. It's the ache that settles into your chest when the news plays on repeat and your soul begins to whisper, "Not again." It's what happens when your heart breaks, not for one person, but for people over and over again. This is political grief. It's the sorrow we carry when the systems meant to protect us betray us, when representation becomes a performance, when history keeps repeating itself and we're the ones that's reliving the pain. Political grief is layered. It's ancestral. It's passed down, picked up, and reignited with every injustice. It lives in our bodies even when we try to numb it. It lives in our breath. It's shallow, tight, and unsure. And yet we keep showing up. We vote, we protest, we pray, we hope, even when it feels like hope is slipping through our fingers. This grief is valid. It's sacred, and it deserves to be named. So if you felt heavy, but couldn't quite explain why, if you've been angry, exhausted, or numb from what's happening in the world today, stay here with me. I want you to know that you're not alone. Let's sit with this truth, not to be consumed by it, but to understand what it's asking of us at this time. Political grief is the quiet mourning we experience when the structures we're told to trust betray that trust. It is the emotional and spiritual weight that builds when justice is delayed, when laws dehumanize, when rights are debated like luxuries, not birthrights. This isn't just disappointment, it's grief, real, physical, aching grief. At the International Death, Grief, and Bereavement Conference, where I presented a poster abstract back in June of this year, I was introduced to the formal term political grief, the grief felt over the state of our political world. It struck a chord. For many white Americans, this kind of grief feels new. It's only recently that some have begun to feel the sorrow of disillusionment, the loss of the American idea that they thought was real. But for Black Americans, this grief is not new. We have always known what it meant to feel politically ignored, manipulated, or even betrayed. The grief of being unheard, unseen, and unprotected has always been part of our story, woven into our lived experiences, our literature, our art, our prayers, and our bloodline. Political grief doesn't need a death certificate to exist. It shows up where communities are repeatedly harmed by the very institutions meant to serve them. It shows up when your vote feels like a whisper in a shouting match. It shows up when you realize your children are inheriting a fight your ancestors never stopped fighting. And because this kind of grief is collective and often ongoing, it can be hard to process because there's no closure, there's no moving on, there's only moving through again and again. For some, political grief looks like tears. For others, it looks like apathy or rage or activism or shutting it all off because your heart can't take another headline. It may show up in your body as a tight chest, a clenched jaw, trouble sleeping, persistent fatigue. That's not just stress. I want you to know that's your body trying to grieve something that hasn't stopped happening. This grief lives in community too, in group chats filled with disbelief, in dinner table conversations that start with, "Did you see what they did this time?" In the silence between generations who have felt this pain before and are watching it rise again. Political grief is real, and the first step in healing from it is naming it. Political grief is not only personal, it's inherited. For Black and Brown communities especially, this grief didn't start with us. It didn't begin with a headline or hashtag. It began generations ago when our ancestors were enslaved, displaced, exploited, and dehumanized by the very systems that still claim to offer justice today. This intergenerational grief, a sorrow passed down not just through stories, but through silence, trauma, and survival. It is the ache in our bones we can't explain, the tension in our shoulders when certain conversations come up, the tears we carry during events that others call shocking, but we call yet again. Our bodies remember what our minds try to forget. This is not just trauma. It is inherited sorrow. And I've learned something important about sorrow. It needs space. For me, that space often begins with emotion. I do my best writing when I'm emotional, not in the chaos of feeling, but after I've given those feelings room to breathe. When I've sat with my grief, honored it, and allowed it to rise, then I can write. Not from confusion, but from clarity. Not to escape the grief, but to shape something meaningful from it. I don't write through my pain, I write around it. And when I tap into that emotional depth, when I work from the truth of who I am and what I carry, the words come easy. That's what many of us have done for generations. Turn pain into presence, turn silence into witness, turn sorrow into strength. In fact, much of our strength has been forged in sorrow. That tug in our spirit to keep fighting, that's grief pulling us forward. But if we don't pause to acknowledge the pain, if we only press forward without naming what we carry, the grief will begin to live in our bodies as stress, illness, and emotional fatigue. We don't just pass down resilience, we pass down sorrow. And we have to make space for both. So let this be that space. Let it be a place to say, I'm tired, not just from what happened today, but from what's been happening for generations. A place where ancestral grief can rise and be met with compassion, not condemnation. A place where we breathe, not because the world gives us peace, but because we are reclaiming it anyway. When grief is this deep and this layered, it needs more than a personal response. It calls for communal care, for embodied action, and for intentional rest. Political grief cannot be held in isolation because it was never formed in isolation. It was formed in systems, in policies, and power structures, so our healing must be collective too. Sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is to gather, to say, I see you, I feel this too. Whether in living rooms, churches, or virtual group chats, community reminds us that we're not crazy, we're connected, we're not weak, we're weary, and we don't have to carry this grief alone. The healing power in that is real. Psychologists affirm that trauma heals in healthy relationships where people are seen, heard, validated, and also respected. As Psychology Today notes, connection reduces shame. It helps regulate our nervous system, and it also provides the safety we need to begin again. So healing happens in groups, not in isolation. So our communal engagement, coming together to work, to witness, to breathe, creates a shared experience that restores our sanity and our soul. Communal grief tending to your grief is not a luxury. It's a necessity, because when grief festers in silence, it then becomes despair. But when grief is shared, it becomes solidarity. Then there's protest. Protest is more than politics. It's a sacred act of grief and hope holding hands. Every chant, every raised fist, every step marched is a way of saying, I'm not okay, and I refuse to let this be normal. Grief and protest are deeply intertwined. Grief often becomes the catalyst, pushing us into the streets, into the voting booths, into the work of justice. It's not just anger that brings people out. It's sorrow. It's mourning for the lives lost, for futures stolen, for dreams that are deferred. Protests are more than policy-driven demands. They're acts of collective mourning. They are spaces where we gather to honor the dead, remember victims, and say out loud what the world tries to silence. This should not happen. Protests for victims of police brutality, systemic racism, environmental devastation. These are not just political actions. They are public memorials. Protest is public lament. It's crying out like the prophets did. It's declaring that our mourning has a voice, and that voice demands change, and it demands to be heard. And when grief is shared, it fosters the solidarity that we need. It unites strangers in a common cry. Songs and chants, poetry, and visual art rise up during protests, not just as resistance, but as collective expressions of grief and hope. These shared expressions help transform sorrow into movement, into something that breathes, builds, and remembers. Protest isn't always in the streets. Sometimes it's in poetry. Sometimes it's in voting. Sometimes it's in what you teach your children or what you speak in a meeting. And for me, I believe that my protest is in my writing, in the books that I write, in the blogs that I write, and also through this avenue of podcasts. And finally, rest. So rest is resistance, not the kind that runs from reality, but the kind that dares to pause in the middle of chaos and say, my body is not a battleground. My spirit deserves peace. As Tricia Hersey, founder of the NAP Ministry, teaches us, rest is not a reward for productivity. It's a right. It's a disruption to grind culture, white supremacy, and capitalism, systems that tell us we're only as valuable as what we produce. She calls rest a portal for healing and reminds us that exhaustion is not a badge of honor. It's often a signal that we've been carrying too much for too long. In the context of political grief, rest becomes a radical refusal, refusing to let the weight of injustice take our breath away, refusing to internalize urgency as your only rhythm, and refusing to believe that your body must suffer to prove your worth. Because political grief doesn't just wear down our mind, it breaks down our bodies. Chronic fatigue, insomnia, muscle tension, burnout. We normalize exhaustion when we should be naming it and tending to it. Tricia Hersey also teaches that rest is a form of reparations. When we rest, we reclaim time stolen by systems that never had our wellness in mind. And we center our dignity, we honor our ancestors, and we plant seeds for the kind of liberation that begins inside. So rest is not passive. It is active restoration. It is sacred rebellion, and it is necessary for grief to move rather than stagnate. So rest unapologetically. Nap, breathe, log off, sit in silence. Let your body remember that it belongs to you. Let your soul know that it is safe with you. Because when grief runs unchecked, it settles in our bones as stress, illness, and emotional collapse. But when we rest, we remind ourselves, I'm still here and I am still worthy of peace. So whether your grief leads you to gather, to speak out, or to lie down for a while, know this: all of it is sacred. All of it is valid, and all of it belongs. Now that we've named political grief, sat with its weight, its history, and its ache, the question becomes, what do we do with it? Because political grief doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade with a trending topic. It lingers in our bones, in our communities, in our breath. And yet there are things we can do, not to fix the grief, but to honor it, to give it somewhere to land besides our bodies. The first thing is we name it. That alone is powerful. To say what I'm feeling isn't weakness, it's grief, right? It's the beginning of reclaiming your emotional truth in a world that keeps telling you to be numb. The second thing is we let it breathe, whether that's journaling, crying, creating, walking in silence, or simply being still. We allow grief to take up space instead of stuffing it down. Number 3, we gather. Grief needs community, not performative connection, but real, raw spaces where you can be messy, quiet, angry, or unsure. Find your people or create the space that you need, because healing often hides in shared sorrow. The next, we act with integrity. Maybe that means protesting. Maybe it means writing letters, voting, organizing, making order, calling someone in. Political grief, when tended to, can become fuel, not rage for rage's sake, but holy urgency to do something. We also rest, and we rest again, because if we don't pause, we pass down the very patterns that broke us. And here's something else we often forget. We're allowed to experience joy. Grief and joy are not enemies. They are neighbors. We can laugh even while you're lamenting. You can dream even while you're deconstructing. Joy is not a betrayal. It's also resistance, right? So what do we do with this grief? We let it speak, we let it breathe, we let it move us gently, honestly, and collectively. And when the world tells us to tough it out or move on or look away, we remember that grief, when honored, becomes not just a weight, but a witness to our humanity, to our hope, and to the world we still believe is possible. Take a breath. Not a shallow one, a real one, the kind that reminds your body it still belongs to you. Political grief is heavy, and that's because it's layered. It's ancestral, it's systemic, and it's ongoing. But naming it is holy, feeling it is sacred, and surviving it, that's revolutionary. You've listened today with an open heart, and you've held truths that are often ignored. And maybe something stirred in you, a memory, a tension, a tear. That's grief doing its work. And healing doesn't always feel gentle, but it always requires honesty. So as we close, let me speak this over you. May you never again question the validity of your sorrow. May you honor the ache without apology. May you find rest that nourishes, protest that awakens, and community that holds you. May you remember that your grief is not too much, not too loud, not too political. It is your birthright to feel and your power to transform. And when the world feels overwhelming, may you give yourself permission to breathe, because every breath you take is a declaration that says, I'm still here, I still feel, and I still believe healing is possible. Amen. And let it be so. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. I hope today created space for you to breathe and find peace on your journey. I invite you to join me again next Monday for another episode as we continue to navigate this path together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and to share the podcast. Until next time, take care and keep breathing unapologetically.